Okay. All right. Hey, so today we're going to talk about, is your relationship healthy or not? Now, I think the biggest thing is when you're thinking about this, when we engage with any type of relationship, whether it be in a romantic relationship, an employee relationship with your parents, family, you want to ultimately know if this is something is healthy and if engaging in this thing is going to bring more to your life or take away from it. And that's what we're going to be covering today. What to look for in a relationship to know that it is healthy or not. And then if we are in a healthy relationship, how do we sustain that? And then if we are in an unhealthy relationship, how do we change it or disengage? And so I'm going to be attacking this on a couple of different levels, a few different levels, right? We're going to be deploying different levels of law. So when I say law, I'm basically saying there's different frameworks to talk about how things work. So there are 7 fundamental degrees of law. Every single framework that exists in the entire world ever, whether it be like Maslow's hierarchy, the personality tests, whether it be like the archetypes with the zodiacs or whatever, all fall within one of these 7 levels, right? And the idea is if you understand how all the levels work together, ultimately, I don't know why I threw that out, ultimately you're going to know and understand how those work together and be able to get a clearer picture of what you're doing now. So there's multiple ways to go at this, and that's what I'm going to try and do today. I hope you guys see it from as many different levels as you can. So let's get into it. Now, one of the biggest things when we start out and we asking ourselves, are we in something that's healthy or not? I think it's important to have definitions, right? Because a lot of people might have different definitions of what is healthy, what is not healthy. And we're just all going to have these different definitions of these words. And it's important that we know what we're talking about, especially when we start going through different levels. So I'm going to do my best to be as clear and concise as possible in my own way to help you guys get what you want. Now, before we get into the video, if you're still with me and you like what you're excited, please like. It makes a massive difference to help me spread this video and help as many people as possible. And yeah, that's what I'm here to do. Anyway, so let's get into it. So first, let's talk about what something healthy means. When something is healthy, we think of something growing, something flourishing, something being able to fulfill its potential. And that's exactly what it was. That's exactly what it is. It's something that is fulfilling, building, and growing to satisfy its potential. Its potential. And that's what we mean when we say something is healthy, right? So it means that you put a seed in the ground and the seed grows into a tree, and then that tree grows and it's able to satisfy its potential. I'm going to check the camera, make sure it's still working. Great. Now, if something is unhealthy, right, it does basically the opposite of this. Basically means it degrades, it breaks down, and ultimately is consumes energy. And its biggest thing is that something that is unhealthy is it's unsustainable. And unsustainable means that it has a tendency where it requires a higher and higher cost for less and less of a gain. While something is healthy, will be usually very expensive at first, but then will usually will give bigger gains, but less cost initially. So the best way to see that is kind of like as a general rule of thumb. Now, this is not always going to be the case directly. It is in terms of law, but you're always going to see is that over time, healthy things are going to do this. So the benefits are going to increase, while unhealthy will have lots of benefits at the beginning, and then benefits will go down over time, right? And you're going to see this graph with blue being the benefits, and then we're going to talk about red being the cost. Cost usually at something for help with, if something is usually healthy, it's usually a pretty high cost at the beginning. So the idea is like, if you're starting like a new habit, or you're trying to learn something that's going to be helpful, like a new skill or whatever, it's a very, very, very high cost because you're creating, right? It's that healthy, when something's healthy, it's fundamentally creative, right? While when something is unhealthy, it's fundamentally consumptive. So it consumes, right? And so usually at the beginning, the cost is going to be pretty high, but then over time, you're going to have this sort of dip in cost, right? Because it's going to be easier and easier. This is like with a new habit, with when you're building a huge relationship, whatever, right? And so a lot of the times, it's going to be a very, very high cost, a lot of energy, right? And like, what are we talking about? We're talking about energy, ultimately, because everything is energy. At all levels of law, everything operates within energy, right? And by the way, these are what I would call 7th degree explanations. These are the most convoluted, but the ones that most people are going to understand. It gets simpler as we go up, but a bit more abstract within all the 7 laws. But this is basically like what you would classify as 7th degree explanation. So here we have the cost of something unhealthy. It's very little cost at the beginning, right? But then the cost gets very high and benefit drops. A good example of things is like drugs, right? You do drugs at the beginning, it's very, very low cost in terms of energy, and you get this huge dopamine hit, right? You get this sense of euphoria, you get this huge benefit. But then over time, right, this space begins to be filled. This right here, what we like to call this is pleasure, right? This graphic here. And so as we see at the beginning with drugs, when something is unhealthy, usually unhealthy things will give you a tremendous amount of pleasure. That's why we do them, right? If something was obviously unhealthy and we knew that it was not going to be good for us, we wouldn't engage with it. But we engage with it because it front loads a bunch of pleasure. And that's why we do it, right? That's why we do unhealthy things, right? And we're going to get this into this later about what type of relationships that means. Now, if you go here, right, and you look at, I almost should do a different color, right? But like, if you come here at the beginning, this blue, I'm going to kind of call it pain, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to call it work. It's a ton of work at the beginning, right? And that work, what we've come to do, now the reason I call it work and not pain, because all work is the willingness to be uncomfortable, which is painful, which can be painful, but it's pain with purpose, right? Hopefully. So when you take pain and then you put it with a purpose, now you're doing work, focused energy, right? And then you're paying that cost at the beginning to get this health benefit. And then the fun stuff happens, right? Which is where you now start getting some pleasure for your healthy couch here. But in a healthy dynamic, that usually comes later, right? Now, in a consumptive habit, right, it's the opposite. So you have a lot of pleasure, and then over here, because once again, the thing you took out here was purpose. When you take out purpose, right, that's one of the easiest differences between what you're going to see is what makes something healthy versus unhealthy, right? Because unhealthy things don't have a fundamental purpose in their operation, right? It's still the same pain, it's still the same pleasure. But when you have pleasure with a purpose so that it's integrated, it becomes a blessing, right? So you work for blessings, right? Fundamentally. And if you have a dynamic that's healthy, that's what is always going to occur. And that's how everything was built all the time, right? There's always a work, a reaction, where there's some, and we can call pain, but just sort of like work, energy, a release of energy, right? Because that's really all pain is a release of energy. But the problem is it's unwanted. And so now we have here pain over here. Easy peasy, right? Just take a screenshot of that or whatever, right? Because this is basically unhealthy dynamic, is that it's going to have very little cost at the beginning, but then later on, it's going to have decreasing benefits at the end. And what happens is all of this needs to come down to balance, right? Because ultimately, it's about fulfilling justice, which is one of the fundamental laws of the universe. And it's not that we can't keep things from progressing, but it's that ultimately when something is consumptive, it's always going to come back to this balancing act. And so this is why purpose is so essential when we're creating things, because nothing can be created nor destroyed. And so for something to be healthy or to be creative, it needs to have a framework of health. It needs to have a vision for what is being made. And when that vision is absent, it very quickly becomes unhealthy. And you're going to see this principle is present in basically everything, every single relationship with yourself, relationship at work, everything. If there's not a unifying vision or purpose that gives context to the energy release, the pain, the difficulties, it quickly becomes it quickly becomes unhealthy. So, this is the biggest problem we have with relationships. So if you're coming here because of a familial relationships, I think I got the wrong. Maybe I've got the wrong stuff to clean my board. But ultimately, this idea behind what you're doing is really about what is it I'm trying to do here and what's the purpose. And so this is the vision. So we're now going to talk about the different types of relationships and how that kind of works in a more scientific way. Well, not scientific, I'm just going to graph it out, right? And show you the 4 fundamental quadrants from a higher level of law. Because now we've been talking in 7th degree, just kind of getting the definitions. This is like normal people speak, right? But now I'm going to start talking in ways of energy dynamics, and then we're going to talk about how that works with energy, and then how we can translate that into our everyday lives. So basically we're defining things at the bottom level, but now we're going to talk about what's really happening at the highest levels of basically like the universe or interaction in general, right? So that we can understand what's going on. So that's really big. I hope, by the way, all these definitions and everything are making sense. Super important that we understand there's more than one way to skin a cat. And so all these connections we're making, I hope some stuff is firing off in your head so that this is becoming more and more clear as we're going. Let me go check the camera, make sure it's on. Sweet. So let's keep going. Now we're going to talk about the 2nd degree, which is basically the second highest form of law, right? And that's really the basis where we want to start thinking of everything as. So when you think of 2nd degree, everything is broken down into 2 fundamental elements of the universe, right? So we have matter, and then we have intelligence. And that's basically it, just matter and intelligence. Now, matter is essentially what you would call the feminine aspect. It can also be called chaos. It can also be called like the womb. But there's a really powerful word, the matrix, right? And then intelligence, this is the masculine, right? Gives form and shape to things. It's order. And you could call this basically the anima or the animus, right? Or like basically the soul of what makes something live. It's life, right? It's what gives life to something. But life doesn't mean anything until it has. When you have these 2 fundamental forces, I should have used different colors actually. I think that would have been better. But when you have these 2 fundamental forces come together, you start getting this Venn diagram, right? So you have matter, you have intelligence. Actually, let's do this right, because this is a really big topic, and I want to make sure you guys are visually seeing this, right? But you see it in like the Venn diagram. So you have this fundamental force of intelligence that operates like this. And then you have this fundamental force of matter that operates like this. Now, when you get these two forces come together, right? Because first everything was together, everything was one. That's first degree law, that's love, but that's so abstract and it's not really applicable here. But really at the top you have love, right? Which is what we're talking about when we talk about a healthy relationship anyway. We're using that word, but that's so abstract. So now we're going to bring that down into lower degrees of law. So now you have matter, the feminine capacity, right? And then masculine capacity and intelligence. And then what happens is when those things merge and start meeting, so you could also call this the negative, you could call this the positive energy. Like we see this at all levels, right? Black, white, up, down, it's relativity, it's polarity, it's how everything exists, right? So when we get at second degree law, when these things start to come in together, they start coming together and then they form this shadow or life, right? Life begins to birth here when you have these fundamental things come together, right? And so how is this demonstrated in life? Like, what do you mean? So it's like, okay, this is all abstract. How do we do that? So now let's move down to third degree law, right? Because once again, we're still talking about what is something if it's healthy. So now you get down, now you have 3 pillars, right? So you have 1, 2, 3 pillars, right? That have been created. So you have the intelligence, you have matter, and then the third thing that sprang up as a result of that. And this is what makes up third degree law. Now, the best ways to conceptualize this is we've seen it throughout time and throughout human history. We talk about these again and again and again, right? So a good example is like in the triangle, for instance, that's the geometrically most powerful structure, right? In terms of like simple shapes. And we see that, and this is where like you see the triangle and the symbolism of the triangle in a lot of different ways. And we can get into like all the sacred esoteric stuff, but really all you need to know is that the triangle is really, really important, 3 equilateral sides, and then you get allusions to it. So for instance, like in the Godhead, right? You get the Father, Son, Holy Ghost, right? And then the Holy Ghost. Actually, yeah, that's actually reversed, right? Those are actually reversed. But it doesn't matter, right? So it's just like you have the Godhead. So you have like Father, Son, Holy Ghost. You have basically this illusion of 3. And 3 is a very important number. And those are the elements of it. But once again, now let's make it practical into your own life. But this is just important. It's this pattern of breaking down that we go to as we start to understand what is fundamentally happening in a relationship, whether it's like I'm fighting with my spouse or I'm not getting along with my parents. It's understanding what is happening with these energies at play. So you would call this, here to balance this out, you would call this in the middle grace. Father, you would call justice. This is really important, justice. This is the balance, this is karma, this is something we all know. And then over here, justice, grace, and then you have mercy. So mercy is basically, essentially forgiveness, right? But grace is that space in between that allows forgiveness, but also allows things to come together. So when these laws are violated, when you violate justice without fulfilling mercy, you need grace. But if you don't have grace and you violate justice, and you can't get to mercy without grace. And so the problem of what makes an unhealthy dynamic is that grace then takes hold and it starts bringing things back to center. Until people can understand how to really master grace, we're never really going to move into healthy dynamics. So this is really important moving forward. And the reason I did all this was just so that we stick on this word grace as we talk about health. So grace, justice, and then obviously mercy. So those are the 2 fundamental elements of what's going on, right? These 2 fundamental energies in any relationship. Now, I also want to use the terms that are going to be really important when we talk about a graph that I'm going to make showing you where are you at with your relationships, right? And what's actually fundamentally going on with our relationships. So here you have under matter, we're going to call it vibration, right? Which is basically how something feels. We'll just say this is feelings, right? This is just how something feels, right? And then we're going to have this thing called consciousness, right? So consciousness is how aware something is, right? And then we're going to call this consciousness thinking, thoughts, thinking thoughts. The thought, like just thinking, right? And the thoughts. And then in this middle part called life, when you have feelings and you have thinking and they come together, what happens is you start to get physical reality, right? So you get physical reality. And then physical reality really functions as more of a shadow of what is going on in thoughts and what is going on in feelings, right? And a lot of people might think, well, what do you mean? Are you saying that reality is beyond the physical? Absolutely. When you talk about relationships or love or any level of concept like that, most of the time you're talking about underlying dynamics that you can't see, touch, taste, smell, or like move. You can't physically interact with those things. Yet that's why wars happen. That's why people cheat on each other. That's why violence happens. Everything you see is a shadow or a reaction of what happens when vibration or feeling hits consciousness and thinking, and then it reacts and becomes out in the physical world, right? And we see that in when we have justice, which is more of the thinking energy, right? And then mercy, which is more the feeling energy. And then that shows up in the physical energy of grace. And grace is almost like this buff. Like we call it like a time lag. We call it like a grace period, right? From the time an action happens to the time we see the result of it, right? So for instance, if you're late on your payment at the beginning of the month, you have like a 4-day grace period till the 5th before they hit you with a late fee, right? So that grace is a buffer that allows what's happening in the thinking world and the feeling world, the world of consciousness and vibration, to catch up with the physical. And it's in this in-between space between consciousness, vibration, and the physical where you as a person have the ability to control or start directing things that happen. And that's what we're going to talk about today and how to do that. But hopefully all this makes sense in terms of the framework of understanding like what is actually going on. And if a lot of this is new for you, I get it. We're going to talk about learning more about this. If you want, I'm going to put a link down below. I can teach you more about this stuff and specifically how to apply these principles in your life to get whatever it is you want, whether it's make more money, date somebody, or just live a more fulfilling life. We can talk about how to take these principles, apply it to you so you can have the best results. I've helped dozens of people with this before, and so I know what I'm doing, and you'd be more than happy to learn this off. But anyway, let's talk about specifically where do relationships sit, and because now when we know where relationships sit in reaction or relation to one another, it's only then when we know where relationships are that we can then direct them to where we want to go. So this is where understanding and having a map of kind of reality and what is going on is super important. And so hopefully you guys are starting to build a bit of a map of what's going on, whether it's positive, negative, thinking, consciousness. There's a lot of words we can use for it. But basically, I'll keep it simple. We'll just talk masculine, feminine, and then you can call life the neutral zone, where it just becomes whatever we put in it, right? And it's all love at the end of the day. It's all beneath love. So we're just going to keep that at the top there. And now, let's get into the actual roadmap we can use to understand how exactly we move, where exactly we are, and then how we actually make progress in our lives. Now, this map you can do for relationships, but really you can do it for just about anything because it's all universal, right? So you can use it for understanding where I'm at, where a relationship is at, where an understanding or skill is at. It's a fairly universal map, right? I call it the Universal Codex, but again, come work with me and we can find more out about that, or just keep watching my videos. Share, like, and subscribe if you guys learned something new and useful. With that, let's talk about building an actual map of these relationships. So now once we start dropping down, we're going to drop down to 4th degree law, right? So 4th degree law is really going to be based in five fundamental principles, but we're not going to go into all of that. But in order to understand, you guys have to know what the Hawkins scale is. So I'm just going to make a little Hawkins scale, right? So let's do and you guys can look it up on your phones or whatever. And I'll put something over here just while we're writing, or just on the video, hopefully, or we'll see. But ultimately, the Hawkins scale basically is a rotation of vibration. It shows basically how vibration works, where at the bottom you have all the really, really negative feelings. So like guilt, shame, apathy, all these really negative feelings, right? Until you get to the middle. Well, it's not really the middle, but it's where you start feeling positive emotions. The last negative emotion and first positive emotion is courage, right? And courage is really important because then we start crossing into positive emotions like reasoning, neutrality, willingness, hope. Then you start getting love, joy, all that stuff comes up here, right? And this is basically, the Hawkins scale, I find, is one of the best ways to tell where you're at in terms of your vibration. Now, in terms of consciousness, as we measure consciousness, I would use the model by Ken Wilber. But once again, guys, there's so many ways to measure this. And even like the 7 chakras, right? This is also that's a 5th degree framework, but those chakras can be used in the same way to interpret all of this too. So there's any map you can use, anything you can think of can be put back into the degrees of law. And if you understand what the degrees of law are, you can help navigate yourself out of any framework, right? So that's why it's so important to understand the Universal Codex. Okay, just making sure my camera's working. So now, 4th degree, so the Kevin Wilber altitudes are basically like, here you have like meta-mind. Now this Ken Wilber framework, I'm pretty sure it's a 6th degree. It's 6th degree, while the Hawkins scale is like pretty fundamental, right? It's a 6th degree as well, because once again, it breaks these things down. But anyway, let's go to like a 4th degree map. So what is it we're looking at? So here we're gonna have consciousness coming along here, right? And here we're gonna have vibration coming along here. So think of up here, you're going to have positive consciousness and positive vibration. No, positive vibration and positive consciousness, right? So this here is where relationships are really, really conscious, and that overlap is, so you're getting that overlap of life of really, really conscious, really, really positive feeling relationships, right? And so these will typically take on an interdependent framework, right? Now, an interdependent framework is super, super important, but we're going to get into all the details later once we really go into what each of the aspects say. But now what happens if something, say for instance, is really, really, really high vibration, right? Or really, really high consciousness, but is pretty low vibration, right? So that's where everybody knows what's going on. They're fairly clever. They're really locked into reality. But like in terms of their vibrations, the way they feel, not very positive. Well, now you're going to get what's called a rivalry, right? And I would say probably most, like people who are like hyper intelligent, you see like these atheists, or not atheists, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but like people who are highly skeptical, very scientific, very analytical, very, very high consciousness, right? They'll typically be right here. These are the type of personalities that they're very clever, they understand the world, how it works mechanically, usually at a 7th degree level, but they have a harder time buying into higher level frameworks because just the idea of vibration and emotionality is very difficult, because this vibration is dictated a lot more by like your own personal circumstances. It's not something you can study yourself out of. This is something you have to experiment and live through, right? Because that's how we raise vibration. We actually live experience to raise vibration. To raise consciousness, you can learn consciousness because that's intelligence. But matter, that's something you have to live through. That's experience. That's raw, hard. That's hard. That's like you got to actually live through that and have these experiences, right? So this is what some of the things you're going to notice in the difference in masculine and feminine energy and how we learn. But I digress. So here we have interdependence and rivalries, right? Another good example of a rivalry can be like where you have employee relationships with their employer, where the employer is trying to get the most out of the employee while doing the least, while the employee is trying to get the most out of the employer while doing very little. And so what happens is they both have these sort of contradicting goals, but they really want the same thing. But because there's not a unified purpose, it creates this tension, right? And so tension sits here on the line in between these in between spaces. And this is where, if you're ever at a point where you're feeling a lot of tension, we're going to talk about what types of tension that creates at these particular points in the graph, right? Just making sure that we're still recording. So anyway, after you move beyond rivalry, now we're going to step into basically where you guys have a very negative vibration and there's also very little consciousness about the relationship or whatever's going on. This is where you guys are just enemies, right? Because there are no enemies. Enemies is not real. Everything is one, everything is love. But if you're at a point where you're so disconnected from that reality, you're going to see everything as an enemy, right? And so that's where you will seek mutual destruction, right? And what's very interesting about this place being enemies and being interdependent is that they are the same fundamental dynamic in that there's a spiral, right? But whereas this is a spiral of consumption or destruction, but I do say consumption in the fact that energy is used to destroy itself, right? Is to destroy or to reduce everything down to the smallest bits of energy there is, right? So consumption or destruction. While interdependence can also have destructive elements in it, but it's ultimately going towards, a creative aspect, right? So this is ultimately fundamentally creative. So enemies, pretty easy. Now when we get up here, what's very interesting is you have a paradigm where you have very, very high vibration, but you have fundamentally very, very low consciousness. And this is where I would say most people are either in rivalry-based relationships or in this last type of relationship, which we'll call codependency. Codependency or fundamentally transactional relationships. So now the difference is here, in codependency, there's this idea or this image of going for something of a different paradigm. So once you start seeing this split, let's actually define the split before I get into. So up here, when you have really, really high vibration, you are going to get what are fundamentally cooperative relationships. Doesn't mean they're always healthy, right? Because not all cooperative relationships are healthy, right? As you're going to see here, all relationships above here, they're cooperative. So this is the cooperative plane, right? Whereas down here, you're going to get fundamentally competitive relationships where they're just sort of adversarial with one another, right? And they're facing each other because rivals and enemies are essentially competitive. But you might ask, well, what's the difference between being an enemy and versus being a rival? Well, one is healthy and one isn't. And that's based in the level of consciousness, right? Because we see when you have really, really high vibration, this is where you move out of competitive into cooperative, right? But in order to have health, or AE, something that is constructive or with a purpose comes as a result as we evolve with consciousness. So as consciousness comes along here we're going to have fundamentally healthy relationships are going to be over here, where they're ultimately based in evolution, right? They're based in growing, and the idea is to advance one while having the other lose, right? Down here in a rivalry, right? But even within that, whether it's healthy or not, if you're within this healthy dynamic, though it's not sustainable, you are going to move forward. Hold on a second. Let me pause. Okay. Had to use the bathroom. Appreciate you guys. Okay, so basically we have cooperative relationships here at the top when there's lots of vibration, right? And then we have healthy relationships, right? In the sense that they move you forward or have purpose in them over here when there's lots of consciousness. So typically, if you want something healthy or to move forward in life, you just need to have lots of consciousness, right? Now, if you want that to feel good, you need to have lots of vibration, right? So if you want to have a positive experience while moving towards something healthy, you're going to need interdependent relationships. Now, if you just want to advance and move forward and grow and you don't care about feeling good about it, then you're going to have a lot of rivalries, right? This is where a lot of people are at with their employment and stuff like that, right? Because there's this fundamental like opposition of not wanting the same things, but you're using each other to get towards the same goal. But at least these are so the thing is, these ideas, these relationships here are transactional, right? And I'm going to say probably about 80% of the world, right? So here in terms of rivalry, people make their money about here. And in terms of like their romantic relationships, I'd say about 80% are codependent, where it's essentially transactional, and that it's fundamentally this idea of exchanging energy, right? Now, the issue with rivalries and codependency is they both are unsustainable relationships. These quadrants are not sustainable, right? Because you see there's a mismatch of energies. There's positive energy here, but negative consciousness here. Or positive consciousness here, but negative energy here. Whereas here you have positive energy, but negative consciousness. Doesn't work. So as a result of it, these are fundamentally unsustainable relationships. That's why these marriages fail. That's why employment doesn't last, right? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, they're not built to be sustainable, right? So these would be, actually, I gotta change this. I gotta change the wording here, because this isn't about healthy. This is about purpose, right? This is about purpose. And this is about self, right? And so usually when you have like really, really high unified consciousness, your purpose is based within an us framework. And usually when you have a really, really high vibration, your sense of self is also based in unity, right? So anyway, so ultimately what you have here is that these relationships, right, are not sustainable. They're not sustainable. They don't go anywhere, right? And so what happens is usually they break down. And so this is where you get a person who will go from company to company to company to company, or a person who's just going from relationship to relationship to relationship to relationship, because they're stuck in this pattern of building, right? So if you want something that's going to last, or something that's going to grow and build, where you start getting really powerful exponential returns, you either have to go full-blown negative, like dark side, right? Or you have to go interdependent. And I would say give this probably about 13% of people move into here, and about 7% of people move into here, right? But the thing about these is these will grow. These will really, really grow and expand, right? But obviously when you have very little consciousness and very little vibration, this will just go towards destruction, right? Until there's nothing left. And as a species, we've moved beyond that. That's in the opposite direction. So human beings, generally, we're shooting to be interdependent creatures. So I'm going to ask you, if you're stuck, you're basically now wondering, okay, Oni, you've given me this map, you've told me where I'm at, and I see that I'm either stuck in cycles of codependency, and like maybe financially, I'm stuck in ideas of being in transactional relationships. How do I evolve? How do I get out of it? Now, this is where we start getting into a really, really interesting 6-degree narrative that's going to be super, super important. Because one of the biggest ideas that's going to change how you move is what is the narrative you're seeing here, right? Now, if the idea is that I just came here and I'm stuck because this is the way I am, then you're always going to be in codependent relationships. You're always going to be in rivalries, where you're always going to want something different than the other person, or it'll be codependency, which usually is a cooperative relationship. But again, it's what happens when the purposes aren't aligned, right? Because the people here want different things and the people here want different things, but they're using each other, right? And so, but the face of it, right, a romantic relationship is supposed to be cooperative, but it's like when you're dating somebody and it doesn't feel like, hey, we're really moving in any direction or we're getting closer to each other, is because ultimately it's based in codependency. And there's this idea that'll be discarded whenever I don't give enough, because that's the truth. It's codependent, right? Or sometimes you might have a rivalry section in dating as well. And so most of the time, what's very interesting though, is in order to cross through the sections, you have to travel in a spiral. So in order to go from rivalry to codependency, a lot of people will have what they call like the honeymoon phase, right? Where you'll either go through an interdependent cycle where it'll work in terms of your movement, but because you haven't mastered fourth degree law, you're not able to sustainably stay in interdependence. So you move back into these codependency and transaction until you can master fifth and sixth degree law. And so we're going to talk about what are the fifth and sixth degree laws, specifically some ways we can encourage that and move about that. So when we understand these laws, we can sustainably hold ourselves in interdependent or enemy paradigms, right? But enemy paradigms are typically like, it's still based in the same focus of law, but the alignment's out of it. We don't really need to talk about this, if I'm being honest, right? But we can if you want to do that, but no, actually I don't. I wouldn't talk about it. So really it's about moving through here, but without meaning to, people move through here. And this is where you start getting narrative arcs, where you have the hero's journey, where it's basically people as they go on their own journey of understanding themselves and growing, they're going through this cycle of learning, right? And now if you go through and you learn the iteration, you'll go through and you'll stop. And then what will happen is you'll then begin the spiral into the higher points of law, right? So if you were really understanding it, you will then go here and start learning higher degree law of love this way. But that also opposite can be true, where if you go and you go, and then you'll eventually say sell your soul or whatever, and then in order to learn these higher degrees of law, you'll then go down the enemy spiral. But these are both evolutions of the narrative at higher levels, right? Because only extreme people, only people who really understand sort of how things work can ever sustainably hold in, for instance, a combative adversarial paradigm or in a truly interdependent paradigm. This is where you get great leaders. This is where you get, really powerful figures throughout history, is that in order to sustain this dynamic of spiral and growth, you have to understand, how do I sustain that? And so let's now go to what do I need to do if I want to change that, right? Because the idea is you just have to ask, where am I at? If I have lots of consciousness, I'm over here somewhere. If I don't have lots of consciousness, if I'm like, what is consciousness? I don't even know a lot. Chances are you're probably over here, right? Now, if you have pretty high vibration, you feel pretty good most of the time, or you only feel bad when you're someone, you're probably in something that's codependent, right? Or if you feel really trashy all the time and you don't have consciousness, you're probably an enemy to yourself. So a lot of this is relationships, but like this can be a relationship with yourself, a relationship with your parents, a relationship with your coworkers, anything. It can just be like, where does our relationship sit? How conscious am I? How aware am I of the relationship dynamics and what is going on? And how do I feel about them? Because if you're aware of what's going on and you're also aware of what you're feeling and your thought, then you'll be able to see where you're at. And then because you know where you're at, now you can then decide where you want to go. Now, most people obviously are going to say, well, I want to be interdependent, right? Obviously, that sounds really, really cool. But a lot of people are shooting for like, I just want to be independent, I want to be left alone or whatever. And once you start going into that, that's when you start moving into enemy territory, where you're an enemy with yourself. Because as a human being, we're built to be fundamentally interdependent. We're an interdependent species. And so if you start saying like, I'm independent, I don't need anybody, I'm just doing like that, you're lying to yourself. Because the reality is that even if you're independent and you don't have any relationships with anyone or whatever, if you're watching this video, you're probably watching from a phone you didn't build. You're probably drinking something that you didn't make, wearing clothes you didn't make, wearing clothes that you didn't create. And you probably, in order to make money, if that's what you're relying on, which is your dependence, you basically decided, okay, I'm going to put all my stake in money, which is cool, but that's still a form of dependency, which essentially is creating a codependent relationship with you and your environment, right? And because you're in a codependent relationship with you and your environment, that's going to show up, right? So that's very, very high vibration, where maybe you might have vibration, but you're not going to feel really good all the time when you're relating to things. So I should almost say that vibration is less about feeling good and more about sensitivity to feelings, right? Because that's really what vibration is. It's just how sensitive you are. Whereas consciousness is knowing why you're feeling this way, right? Having the frameworks and the mental capacity to understand it. So someone with a really, really high consciousness might know how to interpret feelings, but if they have really low vibration, they don't know what feelings they're experiencing because they're not sensitive enough, right? So typically you see women will typically have higher vibration. Not all women, but typically. And men will typically have higher consciousness. Again, not all men, typically. But again, it's not a given because as individuals, human beings are individuals and you can't generalize because human beings are dynamic. And I just learned that this can stick to my board. So that's really nice and convenient. So let's actually talk about what laws are at play and what we need to know and understand in order to change quadrants, right? So there's really going to be 2 questions under a word that I think is going to be essential to understanding how do I change if I'm in a codependent relationship or in a rival relationship, whether it's with my job or whether it's with my romantic partner, whatever. If I'm in one of these 2 modes of unsustainable living, how do I move into interdependence, right? Because that's the goal. We're not trying to be enemies with ourselves or anybody else. So how do we move into interdependence? Checking the time. Okay. So in order to move into interdependence, which is the goal, let's now talk at a level of 6th degree law, where we're being more practical, right? So I want you to ask yourself 2 questions. Well, first, let's establish the idea of narrative. Because narrative is basically the story you're telling yourself about what's going on in your life. And you have to understand, in order to change the direction of your life, you need to have a narrative that supports the energy you're trying to direct. So for instance, if I look at my life as a tragedy and everything is just about like all these bad, terrible things that happen to me, and that's the energy I'm bringing, that's a lot of shame, that's a lot of guilt. If I'm angry and want people to be punished or whatever, my focus needs to be, in order to move into interdependence, my focus needs to be on upping my vibration. In order to up your vibration, it's really by allowing yourself to experience certain emotions. Now, the difficulty is once you start getting close to courage, right? In order to take courage, a lot of the emotions you're going to feel as you start getting closer, you're going to feel things like anxiety. You're going to feel things like anger. You're going to feel things like pride. And these are actually good signs if you're doing that. It's much better than being apathetic or feeling hopeless, because at least these are moving you up the scale towards courage. And so the biggest thing is you need to ask yourself, 1, what is the courageous thing to do? Seriously. If you really want to know, like in your relationship. So for instance, I was talking with this group of girls the other day, and there's this one girl who's in a hella codependent relationship. And she was talking about like her relationship and her boyfriend is being super clingy, and her friends started talking to her about it, and it was kind of weird because I didn't really even mean to get involved, but they brought it up and I was there, so I was like, fuck it, okay, let's go. I didn't give this long ass explanation, but basically they went and talked with her, and it was very interesting because she said, like, in order for me to advance, in order for it to be better, she was like, the courageous thing is she would have to choose herself. She'd have to choose herself. And I thought that was a very interesting choice, right? Because right now she was in a cooperative paradigm with her boyfriend. They were in this weird codependency relationship where he was dragging her down. He had a bunch of issues that were coming up in his life. And he's basically like really hurting her or whatever. And she knew that, she could feel that, but she still had this positive, because she's a pretty high vibration person, super low consciousness, but really high vibration. So she wants to support and help this person and really be there for them, right? But then she would realize I'd have to choose myself, which means she would have to start lowering her vibration or make the conscious choice and start moving towards a healthy us, right? And I thought that was very interesting because in her mind, she would have to move towards a more competitive environment. She would have to maybe become enemies with the guy, right? And drop away from him. So she'd have to move into the other quadrant. Or because if they couldn't, for instance, if you want to move where you're right in order to move into an interdependent relationship, that would require an interdependent decision. And so, for instance, when one person will leave the relationship and the other person isn't okay with it, that's typically why the relationship becomes enemies, because there's very, very little feeling there. There's not a lot of vibration in terms of, and there's not a lot of consciousness, right? Because you guys aren't interacting with what's actually going on. And so that's where you just get the people who break up and now they're bitter enemies and they hate each other, right? And now in order to like really make sense of all this, you have to understand what direction is this going to take. And a lot of times, like I see, she was scared of choosing herself because she knew that even though she might have been the one who was higher vibration, Buddy was lower vibration, but probably high consciousness. And so she was borrowing his consciousness. And that's how they were moving into this sort of negative paradigm state, right? Because these like moments kind of balance each other out, right? And you're going to see that pull into the quadrants later. But that's what happens, right? And someone's got really, really negative extreme consciousness, one way or the other, right? It just creates this pull, this polarity, right? Because everything starts in the middle. That was another thing I needed to go over. Everything starts in the middle in that graph, right? So as you're pulling out, the neutral or the circle is the middle, right? Was having really, really high consciousness that pulls out towards the unhealthy or towards that selfishness is really, really high. But anyway, I digress. I don't want to get into what we talked about that. But she had to choose herself, which would mean she would have to detach from him, right? But then whatever wounds that were happening, that lack of consciousness in herself, she wouldn't be able to have that anymore, right? So then she'd have to have this codependency within herself. She would need to start looking and seeing about that. But that's the evolution of the relationship, right? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, all our relationships are just who we are pushed out. So really, it's about figuring out energetically what's going on, and she needs to add consciousness to her relationships, and needs to add consciousness to herself, right? And then as her sense of self grows, and then her consciousness will grow with that. But she, for instance, can choose herself in that sense, in the sort of the selfish ego, but that's not adding consciousness, which would just doom her to find another codependent relationship and then another codependent relationship until she learned to start moving and living in life more consciously, right? Which then might put her into something interdependent for a while, or she might become a bitter enemy with herself because she might not like the sensitivity, or she might close off, then she'll move through rivalry, and then eventually into interdependence. It's all about the narrative she creates within herself. So then the second one I'd like you guys to ask is like, where am I at now? Where am I at now? And fundamentally ask yourself, am I cooperative or competitive in my fundamental thinking of life? And then ask yourself, how aligned with my purpose am I? Am I purposeless and completely a slave? Or am I clear on my purpose? Because the thing is, if you're cooperative and you're clear on your purpose, you're going to build interdependent relationships. And it's usually just one or the other, right? And then, for instance, if you're competitive and then a slave, you're going to start being an enemy to you and everybody else around you, right? And so it's about ultimately getting clear on purpose and then fundamentally deciding whether or not you're going to just work with cooperative people. But if you view the world as fundamentally competitive, that's where you need to start. You need to work on feeling better, having positive experiences. So in order to really change this, you can study it all you want, but study doesn't help you move from a competitive paradigm to a cooperative paradigm. This is where you need to start having positive experiences and start creating circumstances for those positive experiences to happen. If you guys would like some personal coaching or support on this, let me know out. I also wrote a book by Mr. Reference, Managing Stress. And in there's a little section about how do we create positive experiences in that. So you can go check that out. There's a link in below. For me, right, a lot of what helped me move from this competitive relationship to cooperative relationships was I started writing. And when I wrote, you can also check it out. I wrote The Girl and the Beast, which is my own personal fiction series. I'll also put that down below. That was a big gap for me, right? That was a big way for me to move and understand how important narrative is and understanding how we evolve and grow through our experiences, right? Because when you go through putting your best foot forward, even just having the smallest bit of hope, the universe will surprise you, right? And that's how we move into this higher place. Now, one of the biggest things that's changed for me recently was coming to this idea of purpose. And one of the reasons I started this channel and kind of went on my own journey, which we can talk about in another video, was just me getting clear on my purpose. And when I did that, I started being able to build a lot of interdependent friendships. And I have a lot of really, really good friendships or whatever. And I noticed there's still some paradigms, though, in concerns with the opposite sex that I struggle with because I'm right now really working on building the positive experience aspect of it because I just haven't had them, right? And so a big part of moving through that is you just have to allow that buffer, that grace, which is literally the key to all of this. And that's the last thing I want to go over, is just how do we move grace into our lives and allow this to happen. So ask yourself, what is the most courageous thing you could do in any relationship, whether it's with yourself, whether it's with others, your relationships, in order to really advance and move into a more interdependent place. And sometimes a place of interdependence with a good relationship doesn't always mean you guys are talking to each other, right? A lot of times that might mean you guys don't talk to each other because sometimes that person's in another place. And so in order to balance it out, you've got to take a step away, right? And that's just how it is. So, talking about 6th degree law, or 5th degree, that's actually what we just talked about. We're actually just going to talk about grace. So grace, when you really break it down, is just this balance between justice and mercy. Oop, go. I want to do that. Now, the biggest thing is when we're talking about justice and mercy, any relationship needs these two aspects to really work. And to be independent, we have to have a sense of justice and self-respect. But we also need to be able to balance that with mercy, which is forgiveness. And grace, remember, is that buffer in between. And that's often the most important aspect you got to develop in yourself. So a little homework assignment, really try to come and understand this word, grace. What does that mean? And how do you learn and apply it in your life? And where can it be applied to right now? And because the idea between grace is that space in between making a decision. And justice means the consequences of whatever was done have to come full circle, right? And so you have to allow yourself to do that and surrender to that aspect. Whilst forgiveness as well is about letting those consequences go. But that's in as much as it fills the larger narrative. So a lot of what we're going to give mercy, sometimes mercy can actually work against us if we place it in the wrong place of the narrative. And that's oftentimes what we see in codependent relationships, where someone's bursting or abusing the other person. And so, yeah, that is the lesson about where you're at in your relationships. And if you want to evolve them, you got to ask yourself, Where am I at? Anyway, that's the lesson for today. Hope you guys liked it, and I'll see you next time. Peace.